Welcome to the adventure of the mind and body that is this, Thomas Mann's now 100-year-old novel, The Magic Mountain. If you've made it this far, first of all, well done, and second of all, thank you, and you'll see how personally I mean that as we go along. If you've made it this far, then, you will have seen that after a short, incantatory introduction by Thomas Mann, we've had a not unchallenging, but relatively narratively straightforward journey with Hans Castorp, our protagonist, up the Magic Mountain to the International Sanatorium Berghof, which will be our setting for the entire rest of the novel. We start with Hans Castorp. We quickly learn his name, alone in the small compartment of the train that is taking him up the mountain. We learn a little bit about what's with him, the preparations for cold winter weather, his fashionable baggage and alligator valise, and a book called Ocean Steamships, whose purpose we will learn in the chapter that I actually want to talk about right now. After we get off of the train, we're met by cousin Joachim Ziensen, who has a carriage ready that takes Hans Castorp and himself, Joachim, from the train station at Davosdorf. That's the closest train station to the sanatorium, up the rest of the way to the sanatorium. Then, in the next chapter, room 34, we learn a little bit about the inside of the place, what it looks like, what it feels like, where they eat, what life there is like. In the restaurant, we get a little bit more detail. We learn about Joachim's state of mind and what has kept him in the sanatorium for already an entire 6 months, which seems to Hans Castorp an impossibly long time. That makes up part one of the Magic Mountain. Not very much given the entirety of the thickness, but that's our whole part one. Part two, the texture changes a little bit. In part two, we take a step back. Part two is short as well. And all of part two is taken up by telling us, this is even shorter than part one, I think, taken up with telling us how Hans Castorp got to be where he is, or at least setting us up in the right direction to understand how he came to be going up to this towering peak in the Alps to see a cousin who he hasn't seen in some time, etc., etc. What we learn in part two is thematically a little bit more elaborate. And that is why I wanted to stop here for the first time and give commentary. Because in this chapter, there are spaces opened that it becomes easier and easier to get lost in, which is exactly what we're going to see the characters do. Here we start to learn a little bit about what kinds of forces are working around the characters, what kinds of things are going to come to trap them, or take them, enfold them in the web of the novel, as the narrator at the very beginning says. We learn, perhaps first and foremost, about Hans Castorp's relationship to the experience and the concept of death. The way we learn about that is the same as the way that we learn about his family story, where he came from. Hans Castorp is born to a respectable, relatively wealthy merchant family in Hamburg. This is in the north of Germany. This is not too far from Lübeck, where Thomas Mann himself would have grown up. What we learn is that Hans Castorp lost both of his parents early in life, was adopted by his paternal grandfather, and then lost him too. These are the kinds of things that now we tend to call adverse childhood experiences, a particularly well-known type of trauma, losing your parents, being orphaned a third time when your adoptive caretaker also soon passes away. It's not exactly that Hans Castorp doesn't experience this as a trauma, but it's not exactly that he does either. He seems to understand, even in his childlike non-understanding, something about the way that death connects the individual person with the eternal, with eternity. Really, we learn the most about that through his response to the passing of his grandfather. He said he cries, but what he seems to also understand is that his grandfather, in dying, has entered something like a platonic reality that is not named, but that is very much the sense that we get young Castorp is intuiting when he sees that in death, grandfather has become more like the form in his portrait where he looks perfect. Perfect for all time. Frozen in perfection for all of eternity. So there's something that Hans Castorp, as a youngster, finds not completely bad, not completely horrible, even to use a word that comes up, relieving, in seeing his grandfather decked out in his quote-unquote authentic perfection prior to his burial. His authentic perfection, now what was that? That is how he looked in the portrait that is described in some care. The portrait that is described in some care has grandfather dressed in a ceremonial capacity. So real grandfather is ceremonial grandfather. What's ceremonial grandfather like? He's already an anachronism in his own life. He's already outdated. He wears the dress of his forefathers, already something of the past, already something gone. Grandfather was a conservative in his time, at least aesthetically, maybe politically as well. In fact, we are certainly given to understand as much from the little bit that is said about the political life of the family here. But what really seems to land the most closely with Hans Castorp is an aesthetics of respectability, an aesthetic of wealth. These come together in the idealized, which is to say in a sense, the deceased form of grandfather Castorp. That's Hans Lorenz Castorp. It's Hans Lorenz Castorp, then his son who predeceases all of them is Hans Hermann Castorp. And our protagonist is simply Hans Castorp. The middle name has simply dropped out, and you can see this is a thing that happens in other novels of Mann as well. A certain strength passing out of the family, away from the family. Hans Lorenz Castorp, grandfather, was it says, a man firmly rooted in life, a tree, hard to fell. His son, Hans Hermann Castorp, fell much more easily after already losing his wife, whose name we don't learn, who was a hardier person, a cheerful person, and the first domino to fall. So Hans' mother's Castorp dies unexpectedly. Then, and in relative cheer, then her husband follows in a sorrier state, then grandfather, who is the tough tree to fell, follows after a tough fight with pneumonia, and then passes into the perfection of his aesthetic conservatism. Now, what does the aesthetic conservatism consist of? Well, one item in particular, the Spanish ruff. That helps give shape to Hans Castorp's entire image, not just of grandfather, but of what it means to have honor, to be respectable in a particular old school, military inflected way. That has to do with, we're told here, the Spanish Netherlands. That's a particular imperial moment in history where the Spanish ruff would have been a symbol of domination and respectability in that imperial militarized context. We are going to see the Spanish ruff again, not people wearing them, I don't think, but we are going to see reference to it. We are going to see Hans Castorp thinking about it. That's why I wanted to mention it now, because then when we get on later, where did we see that Spanish ruff again? Why is he talking about that? What does Spain have to do with honor again? This is what this portrait is. What this portrait that's pointing at a grandfather who is already living in an outmoded historical symbology of ceremony is what that is going to be about later. There's another phrase we get in this chapter that we're going to recognize later on, the shadow of respectability. It's going to come up pretty quickly, but the idea is going to cast a long shadow over this entire novel. So, what is the shadow of respectability? The shadow of respectability is something that we first see when grandfather is lying dead and his servant, his very loyal servant who even dresses like him, old Fita is the servant's name, is trying to shoo a fly away from the corpse of his deceased employer, master, as he would have thought of this person. Trying to shoo the fly away without touching the body and without making it look as if he were deliberately shooing a fly away. He has to do it as if he didn't know he were doing it, because to know that you're shooing the fly away means you know that you are touching a dead body. And that, ironically, is what you're supposed to forget in the presence of the dead body made up just so, in its platonic perfection, and also crucially surrounded by tube roses. The tube roses are supposed to send up a heavy floral odor that is supposed to mask any odors that will directly remind a person of death, whether through the actual decay of the flesh or some sort of preserving chemicals. Either way, we cover the smell with the tube roses. We shoo the fly with the gesture. We cover the gesture by making it surreptitious. The fly lands again, surreptitious again. It lands on the forehead, it lands on the nose. What fly? I didn't see a fly. Grandfather is here in his authentic spiritual perfection. There's no flies. The tube roses, they're nice. The tube roses are nice. They're here because they're nice. So I think the most important and elusive thing to understand here then is how Hans Castorp comes out of all of this, on the one hand, suffering all the losses that a young person can suffer, but at the same time developing a certain wholesome, open-hearted, childlike relationship to the idea of passing into eternity, and the idea that he's intuiting what we now might call a dialectic, wherein precisely by something losing its form, it gains its perfect form, or by losing its physical form, it gains its intellectual form or its spiritual form. In some way, the loss or the devastation of one thing leads to the gain or the acquisition of a new form, not so much a transformed form as a transcended one. The really crucial, elusive thing in this chapter is what all this means for Hans Castorp's learning about death, for the state of his mind. That's going to be what he comes into the entire rest of the novel with, and which we are going to spend quite a lot of time with. Things will be less confusing if we understand, well, coming in, the particular flavor of ambivalence that this young person takes into his soul through the loss under sad and terrible but physically controlled circumstances of first his mother, then his father, and then the grandfather who takes over his care after the loss of his parents. If I had to describe what that ambivalence is like, he attaches a certain, well, it's quite directly called a spiritual quality. He develops a spiritual appreciation for death as a concept, and also for the experience attending the passage of a person, of a beloved person, from one being, the physical one, into another. We see a duality of his response that's not necessarily about being internally split so much as he has a certain precocity in taking in both the sadness and the beauty, you might say, of death. It feels perhaps a bit over-optimistic to say that, but I think it is equally fair to say that that is what young Hans Castorp learns from the experience, especially of seeing his grandfather pass on into this ideal form. This is something that we'll keep in mind as we see Hans settle into the sanatorium and suddenly, for the first time in his life, be absolutely surrounded by death. And with new ways that people attempt to cover or not cover what's happening, a completely new set of procedures for handling the shadow of respectability. So these remarks, I hope, will make it a little bit easier to find our way through that conceptual jungle as we continue our way up, or shall I say down, into the depths of the Magic Mountain with Hans Castorp and his friends, and with Thomas Mann. Thanks, everyone.